The Story of the Jews is Simon Schama's epic multimedia account of Jewish history from ancient times to the present. It's comprised of 2 books, the first of which we're talking about tonight, which takes readers from 1000 BC through 1492 AD. The second volume advances the story to the present, and that one is due out in the fall. And in addition to the books, there's also a 5-part documentary series that will be airing on PBS beginning next Wednesday, March 25th at 8 p.m. Please be sure to check KQED's website for more details. And please join me in thanking KQED as tonight's community partner. Simon Schama is a noted scholar and professor at Columbia University, the award-winning author of 16 books, and the writer-presenter of 50 documentaries on art, history, and literature. The Story of the Jews is arguably his most personal project. And speaking on behalf of his fans for a moment, I'd like to say that it's an incredibly satisfying experience to read this book and watch this documentary series come to fruition, knowing that it's a full circle moment for him as a scholar, a son, and a Jew. There's obviously no shortage of documentaries or books on Jews and their history, and yet you'd be hard-pressed to find one so engaging, broad in scope, honest in its probing, devastatingly sad without being lachrymose, and yes, at the end of the day, deeply, profoundly proud of its heritage. It's simply the most Jewish of projects I've come across in a very, very long time. Appearing here in conversation this evening is our good friend Adam Hochschild. He's the award-winning author of King Leopold's Ghost, To End All Wars, and Bury the Chains. Ladies and gentlemen, Simon Schama and Adam Hochschild.
It's Manischewitz, in case you're honest.
Well, welcome to San Francisco.
Thank
welcome to the JCC. It's great to have you here. One of the things we're going to do this evening is to see a few clips from the TV part of this project. But before we start with that, Simon, tell us a little bit about how it came about.
Well, I did write a book on Jewish history. It was my second book. It's called Two Rothschilds in the Land of Israel. It was written in circumstances of patronage. I was doing a kind of informal Jewish seminar. I mean, I guess actually there's a backstory. Amazed, right? I'm about to embark on a digression. The backstory is that I think English history and Jewish history were the 2 histories when I was growing up as a kid in the 1950s, both of which have been pulverized by the war but not counted out. And on my father's bookshelf together were Weizmann's Trial and Error and Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples. And there was the sense for me already as a very small child that history was more than a stroll down memory lane. It had in some instrumental sense something to do with survival. So I never really, so the Bible was a place of extraordinary historical excitement for me to be reading. I read the stuff that people skip over, these unspeakable things Midianites do the Amalekites, or we do to both of them, or, I loved that sort of stuff. I always thought the New Testament was for sissies, basically. That there are not any evangelists out there. So that was really as much, that was very important to me as history. So on the other hand, in the 1960s, when I was growing up as an historian, you fell into 2 camps, and I bet you did this too, Adam. Actually, I think you are, I presumptuously say in my camp, you either thought about history as the genealogy of you, that's to say you did your personality, some sort of sense of where have I and my immediate world come from, or you didn't. You actually reached for something really quite far away from you. History, by definition, is a reach spending time with people who are not of your time and place. And that was my view. So I, became part of the world of French history and Dutch history and so on. But this never quite left me, and I ran an informal seminar with my friend called Nicolas Delange, who was Amos Oz's great translator, because you couldn't do Jewish history at Cambridge in the late 60s, post-biblical history. So it was on my mind. And then, because of that, back to the Rothschilds, I was summoned one day by one of the most brilliant and dangerous people I've ever known, Lord Victor Rothschild, who said, do you know about the Palestine Colonization Association, which was the involvement of Edmond de Rothschild in Palestine before Zionism, and I did know a bit about it. And he said, well, we've got this archive in Haifa. Can you go, but we don't know whether it replicates stuff in the Central Zionist archive. Can you look at it? And say, well, I'm not particularly a Jewish historian. I read Hebrew slowly. I certainly read French. And he said, well, that means, and it was February in Cambridge, and it was needle rain. And he said, and in this Rothschild way, he said, I've taken the liberty of booking you on a flight on Thursday. So I did. So, and the only thing I would add to that, so I wrote the book, actually, but I wrote it not quite fast enough. You really don't want to be, I had the feeling that I don't ever want to actually be beholden. He didn't ever lean on me to say something that, there was no censorship involved, but there was a kind of bullying about when the book would be produced. And there was one time, famously, where Victor said, after having plied me, he would do this kind of shocking thing with lots of Rothschild wine, and he would smoke Abdallah cigarettes to you. And he said, do you know what the motto of our family is, Simon? I couldn't remember for the moment. He said, service. And by God, we get it. And being a Rothschild, I said, well, I came back saying this is an incredible archive, particularly the sort of First World War part of it, the Aliyah Aleph part of it. It was sort of records of the way the earlier settlers from Radom in Poland and Romania bribed their way through the Turkish authorities and had complicated relationship with the Druze and the Arabs. It was a great archive. So I said, but I can't go to Israel. He said, oh, that's all right, And he actually, kind of heir Rothschild, brought all the documents, boxes and boxes of them, to Cambridge. And he built a little room for me in the history library to actually work in. And there was a terrible moment, one in summer, because these huge number of boxes had to be stored in a college library. College actually was not a library, it was a kind of sort of storeroom prior to them going into the custom-built library for it. And I was woken about 3 o'clock in the morning by the college porter. You know this, Adam, when they say sir means it's an expression of incredible contempt, really, and mixed with pity. So he said, Mr. Schama, sir, something's going on with your boxes. And I thought, oh. And he said, I said, what? And he said, well, they're a bit damp. And I sprinted to this storeroom, and it was more or less like the last hours of the Titanic. Pipes had burst, boiling water was rising up the walls. And I thought, I am so dead. I roused all the students at the college, and this sort of multiple bailing went on. And I thought, what am I going to do, And I remembered that I'd worked a long time before with a man who'd worked in the Florence flood disaster, and I called him up, got him out of bed, 5 o'clock in the morning, and he said, it's all right, Simon. And about an hour later, he arrived with a fleet of small Morris Minor cars and more blotting paper than I'd never seen in my... It's absolutely true. I mean, hung up. So Rothschild was very good, but what I came out of that, immensely long answer, I was thinking, this is a bad idea. I'm too close to the material. It's too much, I'm too implicated in it. It's, I need to go off and do American history or more Dutch history or write a Rembrandt biography, which I did. So why then come back? I think the answer is that it was still in my mind. What I knew, and what is the case, with no disrespect at all to the scholars, there is dazzling scholarship in practically every area of Jewish history. The science of inscription, epigraphy, for example, is an intellectually electrifying discipline right now. It's really about how the language of the Bible came into being. But what you don't have, with the exception of Paul Johnson's book and Howard Sacker's book, and these books are quite now old, is a kind of full-on narrative. And so I thought I suppose when the BBC phoned me up and said, would you think of doing this? I thought, well, if I do, I will have to nail Samuel Beckett's famous admonition, fail better, to the wall, which I did. But I also thought of my dad's remark that you only regret the things you don't do. So I took a very deep breath. And I also thought I should say that in Europe, where this project started, in Britain, there is a chasm of ignorance about Jewish history. And Jewish history, when it's seen in the non-Jewish community, is mostly to do with the Holocaust and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And either way, I don't know if you've found this, with the Holocaust, people are nervous of treading on the ashes of Auschwitz. And with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they're just so extremely and histrionically, for good reasons, polemically engaged. So I thought, what if I tried to provide a kind of invitational access to a more complicated story which says, there's no Jewish separate history, because the Jews have never been separate, even when they think, unless they've been forced to be separate, like the Warsaw Ghetto, they've never been separate from other cultures in which they've been embedded. And so it's everybody else's history too. So there's a short answer for you. It's the Manischewitz, I blame it.
Maybe this is a good
I thought actually Adam would probably go away and make a phone call and go on vacation and come back, and I'd still be going on and on and on.
Maybe this is a good time to see the Elephantina clip.
That would be great.
You want to say something about it first? Or
do.
Yeah.
I suppose... It's a shock, right? I do.
I got my phone.
You're a brave man.
Phone right with
Okay,
me.
you can go with that.
Yeah, keep going. I'll be back. Yeah.
The book begins, but the film does not begin. But it's a very important part of the first film, not with Abraham and the patriarchs, because there is no archaeological evidence. A lot of the trouble of the book, anybody who works in Jewish history, is when you bring, if you're really trained as a historian, when you bring myth to the scrutiny of historical evidence. Mm-hmm. And, I just thought, what does one do except, I'm very struck by some books which are in other respects extraordinarily brilliant, but actually treat the kind of migration of Abraham from Chaldea or the story of Joseph in Egypt as though we had any evidence whatsoever that it actually happened. We don't. It doesn't mean to say, and this is true even of the Exodus story, it doesn't mean to say it didn't happen, but it's not history in that sense. Mm-hmm. But we have this extraordinary trove of mostly papyrus coming from an island on the Upper Nile, pretty much right opposite Aswan, so where there used to be the first cataract, the traditional border of ancient Egypt, between Egypt and Nubia, which is the documents, they're legal documents, as you'll see in the clip, of a colony of mercenary soldiers. Jews have not always been doctors and intellectuals. They've been starkers too, as well. You're a Persian governor of a rebellious Egyptian province, and you want tough guys to man the customs posts. Someone get me some Judeans, but they were all with their families. So you have a world, they are observing Shabbat after their way. They're observing Pesach, but it's unclear how much of Pesach, very unclear how much of the Torah they knew, probably a lot of it. But the Bible, we're in the mid-5th century BC, the period of the Persian license to rebuild Jerusalem. So the Bible is being written as this goes on. And this is a world of Jews which is oblivious of not just its obligation to suffer, but oblivious of the teleology of the chosen people. It just wants to get on with living a kind of ordinary, if not banal life, as many of us do. The great drama in Israel now is the drama between those who see the fact of being an Israeli as wanting a kind of providentially ordained existence, and those who really just want to get on with life in Tel Aviv or Haifa. That's at the root of the argument. That argument's been going on for thousands of years, so maybe we'll play the clip.
Let's go back a few thousand years. Can we have that first clip, the one that's labeled Elephantina?
At precisely the same time that Jerusalem was being purified by the Babylonian exiles, here in the very Gentile world of Upper Egypt, exiles were living a Jewish life of a very different kind. This is Aswan, where the Nile once plunged over the first cataract. Here, on an island called Elephantine, stood a fortress town guarding the frontier between Egypt and Nubia to the south. Since the 7th century BC, it had been manned by Judean mercenaries who lived on the island along with their families. A century later, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and carried its elite into exile, some of the ordinary people, finding themselves abandoned, made their way south, an exodus in reverse.
There was one great formative moment when the Israelites became Jews, and that, of course, was the exodus from Egypt. And the Nile ran through that story like a silver thread. That destiny had begun when Pharaoh's daughter had found the baby Moses in the river and taken him back to be brought up as a prince of Egypt at court. When that prince had turned liberator, his God had turned the Nile to blood in an effort to persuade Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. So, to return to the Nile was to repudiate that history, to take away that covenant, to un-Jew themselves. Yet, to the disgust and dismay of the prophets, back they went all the same.
Even today, it's easy to imagine what life must have been like in the narrow streets and close-packed mud brick houses of Elephantine, where Judeans mixed with other races and creeds. We know in detail about their lives, thanks to a rich trove of papyrus documents found on the site at the end of the 19th century. Mostly, they're legal documents, marriages, divorces, property disputes, wills. But between the lines, we find out about the kind of Jews who lived here. We know they honored Moses' law, or as much of it as they knew. They prayed to the Jewish God, but they also invoked his consort, the Queen of Heaven. Some took Egyptian wives and husbands who converted to their religion and changed their names. Now, just ask Jews in Los Angeles or St. John's Wood today if any of this sounds familiar.
The people who feature in the Elephantine papyri are not the grandiose patriarchs and prophets of the Bible. They're ordinary, everyday Judeans. The documents really are the first complete portrait we have of an entire community of Jews.
So, this is an island in the Nile.
Yeah.
How far in from the Mediterranean?
Oh, hell, I have no idea. It's, I just don't know, hundreds and hundreds of miles.
Hundreds of miles.
Yeah.
So way down to
Way
the
down south. I mean,
way down
really
to the
is, yeah.
south.
Yeah.
And how many thousands of years back is this community that you're
it's
talking
the 5th
about?
century BC. So, well, actually, the community started, we know, from Persian documents as well as these papyri, in the 7th century BC. So, 2,700 years ago. So, yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about the people who were living on the island. How they were brought there by by the Egyptians?
Well, I mean, that we can't be sure, because actually the documents, this is something that's, very curious. We have the documents of their arrival. There is no kind of, the Bible says, Jeremiah is upset that they've gone back. It's thought, the archaeologists think that after the destruction of the kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BC, there was already a migration from the remnants of northern Israel, the kingdom of Israel, to where the jobs were. And there were jobs, that notwithstanding the importance of the Passover story, Egypt was where the money was, the jobs were, and there was no reason to stop Jews from being, practicing their Israelite religion. We should perhaps call them Israelites. And then, as I say in the clip, after the Babylonian destruction, and everything we now know and are coming to know about what happened to not just Jerusalem, but the whole country around Judea into the Jezreel Valley and almost as far as the sea, was a fantastic devastation. The depopulation was extraordinary, and the whole agricultural economy of the 6th century BC was, sent back to an incredibly rudimentary level. So, as I say in the clip, famously, the Bible seems to be independently correct about that. The scribal class go to Babylon. The remnants of the royal house of Judah famously have a kind of puppet exile court in Babylon. And the Bible, many of the books of the Bible, it doesn't start being written in exile, but a lot of progress is made on writing the Bible, which leaves a lot of the people stuck in this utterly devastated, ravaged world. And there was a world not far south that was not ravaged. So there is a migration, not just to people who are going to be mercenary soldiers. The father, for example, of the young lad who I begin the book with, called Schama, is somewhere in Memphis. So you assume they're kind of traders or something like that. And what is remarkable, not in the clip, about the Elephantini community is that they are so flourishing, they build a temple exactly at the moment when Jerusalem rules and the second temple is beginning to be built, courtesy of King Cyrus, with the express prohibition of any other temples, by which was meant not just a place of worship, but a place where you sacrificed animals. A temple of a very blingy kind is being built in Elephantini. And because we know exactly what it was like, because it gets eventually, it was slightly tactlessly built next to the Egyptian temple of Khnum. Khnum is the god of the inundation of the Nile. He is a ram's head god. What do we do on Erev Pesach? Lambs and their shank bones. It was not a very tactful thing to do. So there's a lot of kind of... so it's a wonderful early parable of how do you share common space with two different religions. And so when, in fact, there's a violent attack on the Judean temple, the chastened Elephantines write to Jerusalem, and we have that papyrus, because the Jerusalemites write back saying, yes, we give you permission to rebuild whatever you want to call it, but you're not allowed to make animal sacrifices anymore. Jerusalem rules really hold. And we know there were cedar roofs, there were gold and silver vessels, there were these 5 monumental gateways. It was an extraordinary place. So it was kind of, without falling into the sense of projecting back from San Francisco or, Bel Air or whatever, or Manhattan or wherever, there was this extraordinary sense of a kind of sort of innocently, slightly vulgar community of Jews who want to be, Judeans. They all have theophanic names. They all have Nehemiah. They all have names taken from the Bible. They don't have Egyptian names. In fact, there's one wonderful woman called Mibtachia, who is a kind of high-born, she's part of the temple clan. There's a whole kind of establishment of fancy schmancy Jews who are running the temple. And Lady Mibtachia, who has a kind of grand household, and she goes through husbands like nobody's business. And they're often Egyptian husbands, particularly Egyptian builders. And as because she's building, she gets sort of discount on interior decoration, clearly. And one of them is an Egyptian builder who the condition of marrying Mibtachia was to be called Nathan. So, it was possible, and this is all in these wonderful documents. So it's an incredibly vivid account. We have no account in the Bible of a Judean/Israelite Jewish society at this time in its day-to-day activities. And one of the incredible things, you've got to go, Adam, if Egypt calms down a bit, we hit Egypt filming between the two, disasters. We had men with very large guns and a kind of government minder, but we could kind of go where we wanted. That I hadn't expected, you saw just a brief glimpse, is that, these are mud brick houses, and they're all pretty much there. The chimney pieces are there, the hearths are there, the animal stables are there, the alleyways are there, as they say in the piece. And, these alleys were the kind of places I used to lurk in London in the 1960s. I had the strongest sense of what it was to be a kind of, a bit of a dodgy character, really, in Elephantine.
Before we leave Egypt completely, tell us about something that I was fascinated by in your book, another trove of documents, the Cairo Geniza. Is that how you pronounce it? Yeah.
The Cairo Geniza, some of you, I expect, know, was also discovered in the 1890s by two Scottish ladies who were kind of touring, and it's in a particular synagogue which still exists, so they rebuilt many times, in Fustat, which is in so-called Old Cairo. And in the Jewish tradition, which is very, very touching in a way, because for a book called The Story of the Jews and volume 1 called Finding the Words, if a book mentions or if a document or a letter or something has the name of God in it, but that became extended to any kind of Hebrew writing, you don't destroy it, you don't burn it, you don't throw it away. You find a kind of equivalent of a kind of paper ossuary for it, a repository.
So those of us who keep all documents and so on can actually feel that we're living with thousands of years of traditions by not throwing things away.
Indeed you can. And you go there and there's something like, in the end, 300,000 documents, an unbelievable trove. And it goes from everything from poems to business contracts, the first checks. What the Cairo Geniza, which has documents dating from, I think, the earliest are in the 10th century, maybe maybe even some from the 9th century AD, all the way through to the 16th century, and some on from that, shows this extraordinary empire of dispersed traders, as well as, again, doctors, philosophers, theologians, rabbis, which extended from the Atlantic coast of North Africa all the way to India. Indian trade's incredibly important. The great scholar is a man called Shlomo Goitein, who wrote a whole book just about Jewish India traders in the Middle Ages. And they are wonderful. Everything is there, and some of which we show in the film. And there are just so many moments. So, for example, the first piece of Jewish sheet music written by a Christian convert who was proselytized. It is not true, everybody here, that Jews are not interested in proselytizing. We have proselytized many times over the centuries. The Talmud, though, has a kind of wonderful, acknowledges that we've been interested in converting people, but not like Christian missionaries. But typically Jewish style, if somebody comes to you and says, I want to be a Jew, you say, you've got to be kidding. Do you know what you're letting yourself in for? So there's, and you have to make these long speeches about how terrible it is to be a Jew. Have you thought for a minute about adult circumcision, for example? And then they say, I don't care. I said, okay. But we have made proselytes, and one of them was Obadiah Ger, who was a Dominican priest who then became a Jew. And he wrote this extraordinary kind of beautiful music for the synagogue in praise of Moses, which sounds exactly like a Gregorian chant. It's really wonderful. And the notes, that's one of the things that's in the Cairo Geniza. There are wonderful Aleph Bet Gimel Hebrew learning exercise books, which we do show in the film. And there was one that, sometimes you just sort of step back in time and a piece of evidence or a place just sings to you, because actually there was this little, I think probably 5 or 6 year old practicing his or her hey or vav, and girls were taught Hebrew. And when, actually, no, it's, excuse me, I mean, it is hey and vav, but then there was a page with the gimel, and because obviously gimel sounds like gamal for camel, he or she drew a little cartoon camel on it. And that comes from the 11th century. So I mentioned the Indian traders because actually Jews are forbidden to transport currency. So you really had to establish your credit worthiness at the place you were importing silks or spices. So the only way you could do it was actually to establish a kind of an account with some Hindu or Muslim banker on the coast of Calicut. So what would let you do this? Answer, a primitive form of check. And the primitive form of check, I promise to pay the bearer and so on, would actually have the name of God in many different languages, in Indian languages, in Arabic, and in Hebrew. So it's an amazing, amazing thing. And it's still, much of it is on, you can go to Cairo Geniza, everybody, and it's starting, huge amounts of it are going online. And some of it's translated, some of it's still in Hebrew. It's just absolutely wonderful. Another great bit of the Geniza, which is relatively recently, last 10, 15 years, when Yehuda Halevi, the poet, he's forever saying he wants to go to Israel, Eretz Yisrael, and die there and so on. But when it comes to it, he procrastinates like crazy. And he goes to Egypt, and he's stunned to find he's an immense intellectual celebrity in Egypt. And he's treated to kind of rose petals and musicians and girls with bangles and anklets. And suddenly he's not so keen on going, making it all. Suddenly Jerusalem slightly disappears from view. And so the accounts, actually, his own letters to his Egyptian hosts and about how he's been treated is wonderful. So the entirety of a kind of Jewish world is miraculously in this archive.
Let's move forward a bit in time and to a different continent and maybe look at the Venice clip.
That'd be very nice.
All right.
Should we just play it?
Let's play it and then talk about it after.
Okay.
Can we have the Venice clip?
Today, the word ghetto is synonymous with poverty, racism, families under stress. All the above were true of here, the world's first ghetto. And yet, there are places where you can feel the sigh of relief that was Jewish Venice. A place for all its condescension and humiliations where you could actually make a Jewish life. Nowhere more so than La Scuola Spagnola, the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, where the birds in flight from Spain came to rest. When it came to redesigning the synagogue, the Sephardim thought big and beautiful. By now, the Jews were old hands at living under the sufferance of Christians and Muslims. And under pressure, they went back, as always, to the core of their religion. They followed the mitzvot, the commandments, they sung the songs, they read the books, they built the synagogue.
I have the strangest sense of having been here before, hundreds of years ago. This is a delusion, I know, but Jews are tied together by irrational bonds of memory very often. There's a sort of odd air of spice and old Jews, of which I'm one now. This place is so beautiful. It speaks for me of the deep pathos of Jewish longing for beauty, for grandeur, Jews never really think it's an obligation to build gorgeous ornaments, gorgeous buildings, because you always know you're going to have to leave them behind. You're going to have to reach for the suitcase sooner or later. And yet, you want to believe that in the place you've just come to, where God has allowed you to prosper and for a few generations at least be safe, honor your religion by doing this, by making something stunningly beautiful. So this whole place feels as though it reconciles the idea of refuge with beauty. And if you can bring that off just for a little moment in the hard lives of Jewish history, you have performed a mitzvah, just as surely as you've looked after the poor, the sick, and the dying. That's what it says. That's what Venice says. And if anyone has cliches about the ghetto, you bring them here to see how beauty can also be a mitzvah. That's what I feel.
So, tell us a little bit about that community that built that synagogue.
Yeah, I will. I just want to add to that piece two things. One is that very often, television is a very kind of, it's a tyrant in a way. There are certain kind of languages you use in television, the language of the weather forecaster, the news anchor, the occasional Saturday Night Live comedian or so on. You have certain sorts of conventions, and you kind of obey them. It's unforgiving if you violate them. And in historical documentaries, incredibly scripted, talking head sessions, carefully balanced between the conservative, the liberal, the man, the woman, the black, the white, and so on. But just, there was this old genre in British television in particular, Kenneth Clark and Bronowski and others, really, that violated all that just really let locations speak. And if you work with a great director and you write a piece of script, but you actually get to a location and you think, well, I'm just the ventriloquist for the dead. I'm just going to wing it here. That is one of many pieces of camera that was completely off the cuff and improvised, and a kind of sense, you really just feel the location flowing through you. The other thing that didn't make it into that final clip is remarkable, and that beautiful structure, which was the expansion of the Portuguese-Spanish synagogue, the Panentine synagogue, was that it was built by Baldassare Longhena and his workshop. And Longhena, many of you probably will know, is the great Baroque architect of Christian Venice. He is building this synagogue and the Church of the Salute, the church that becomes the Salute, actually. It was always going to be a great Baroque church, and it becomes the Salute after Venice survives the plague of 1630 at the same time.
He was Jewish?
No,
he was
that is the point, Adam,
Yeah.
that so many are, the great projects are actually de facto collaborations, and that is true of the ghetto. The ghetto is the ghetto. It's founded in 1516. Before that, Jews had to live in Mestre, but it was a porous ghetto, unlike the Roman ghetto, which is a much more tragic place. The Venice ghetto shuts its gates at dusk, and the bridges are locked. But during the day, people came and went. Jews came and went and worked in the rest of Venice as not just doctors and traders, but rather remarkably, dancing masters. That was a big speciality of Italian Jews. The greatest choreographer we know about, the dancing teacher of Isabella d'Este at Ferrara, was a Jew called Isacchino Maserano, who was the kind of, Balanchine of his day, which is rather wonderful. Gentiles came in as artisans and worked in the Jewish workshops in the ghetto, and sometimes they came in for entertainment. We know in 1530, is it 1530, 1531? Can't remember, 1531, I think, that a crowd of Venetian patrician aristocrats come on Purim to see the Purim plays of the Jews, which already started to be a kind of very kind of freewheeling form of early showbiz. So it was sort of, you still officially had to wear marks of distinction on your dress, but they were seldom enforced, and it was a kind of interesting interface between the Jewish and non-Jewish worlds.
You know, you said in that piece of film that you had the feeling of having been in this place yourself hundreds of years ago.
Do you ever have that when you go to? I bet you do.
Not quite.
You don't?
And
Okay.
I'm curious about it.
Okay.
I guess that sort of leads to a larger question, which is, did working on this project make you feel differently about being Jewish? Because I know you were bar mitzvahed, you went to Hebrew school, but you've lived a fairly secular life.
Yeah, that's
since
true. I
then.
taught at Hebrew school, but I have led a fairly secular life. I now go back to synagogue a lot, and I don't know how much more of a literal believer I am, but I certainly, there's a very important Freud sequence in the first program, who is someone who makes a return at the very end of his life to Jewish culture. Freud is someone who never, ever, ever dodged his Jewishness. He hated Jews who pretended that they weren't Jews, but he was, as he put it, a godless Jew. So the issue then, the question I think it actually kind of brought out the sense of this immense territory of Jewish identity, of which you all coming here are an expression, I think, between strict orthodoxy, and actually there is almost no orthodoxy so strict as to be clear about what constitutes incommensurably exact obedience to the Torah. None. For example, I once gave a lecture, and don't worry, you're not going to hear it, called Are Locusts Kosher? And if you read Vayikra, Leviticus, they are crunchy birds, they're fine. If you read Deuteronomy, they're not fine, they're creeping horrible insects, and you can't eat them. So very early on, and of course Hasidism, which has become inaccurately a synonym for extreme religious observance, it wasn't that at all. It was a very specific post-Kabbalistic, emotive cult, really. Hasidism, of course, was violently condemned by some of the more severely flinty rabbis in Lithuania. So even at the Orthodox end, there was no absolute clarity about what. So between that and between disappearing into the meld of a totally secular, non-Jewish world is an enormously expansive. For example, many Jews who probably don't believe, that Jonah really did spend a weekend in the belly of a large fish, nonetheless celebrate, as we do in our household, Seder and Passover. And we buy into the shared memory of what that represents. And that is the sort of, I suppose, I felt, well, that's not just cowardly, shifty, wishful thinking. As Jonathan Miller, my friend in Britain, famously was asked, whether he was Jewish. And he said, well, yeah, I'm Jew-ish. But being Jewish actually turns out to be a huge area of existence.
It seems to me that actually, now that I think about it, these days you often find mainstream Protestant theologians saying, well, all of this stuff about, Christ rising from the dead and the Trinity and so on, think of it as metaphors.
Yeah, I must. Lenny Bruce's. Lenny Bruce's.
No.
Do we have any devoted Christians? God, I really hope not in the audience, but we made it. Well, Lenny Bruce said of that particular moment, okay, it's true. We did it. We killed him. For 3 days. Very, very naughty. So that's kind of metaphorical view.
But the point is, today, they will talk about it as metaphor, whereas 50 years ago, you didn't hear people saying that. But it seems to me that in Jewish culture, the talk about these things as metaphors rather than Jonah literally being in the belly of the whale started much earlier.
Yeah, it started at the latest with Maimonides. The first great authority of total devotional orthodoxy and fierceness to think about the use of reason when applied to everything the Bible says is Saadia Gaon in the 9th century in Babylonia. So already there's an argument about the status of miracles. Did the sun really stop over Ai as Joshua fought the battle? And Maimonides is, fairly withering about miracles. He wants absolutely to say, and he's attacked for that, of course, actually, much as the equivalent in Islamic debate would be attacked for sort of challenging the absolute literal precise truth of every single story that's in the Bible. So that argument about what, you know, can be construed to be historically exactly right and what should be understood as some sort of poetic message is unbelievably old, and to the credit really of our imaginative interpretation. I mean, Midrash really is an argument of that sort, I think.
Why don't we go now to a part of Europe where the experience of the Jews was extremely different than Venice? I'm thinking of the clip about Zvonarska in Slovakia. You want to give us a little background on that before we see it?
You know, some of the, you'll have seen this from Venice, from what I just said about Venice, but again, especially for non-Jewish audiences, but for Jewish audiences too, I didn't want it to be, just an endless cycle of calamity. It's a mistake and ridiculously, it would be very absurdly, well, it would be untrue, not just counterintuitive, to say a lot of Jewish history has not been about suffering and disaster and tragedy. But the opening, actually, the second program about the Middle Ages begins with a gorgeously, gloriously illuminated Bible that's produced just 16 years before the expulsion of the Jews in 1492. And one of the pages which was most gloriously illuminated is the passage from Deuteronomy, which says, I've set before you a blessing and a curse, life and death, therefore choose life. And I think the kind of, if you flip the sense of worrying about calamity around the corner, you know, reaching with the suitcase, the answer is Jews have also shown the most extraordinary appetite to get a grip on the vital essence of daily life. And so I really did want to balance off the sense of grief and mourning with color. We think about our Jewish existence partly maybe because of the way the Haredi and the Hasidim dress in black and white. And color is extraordinarily important. It appears in blazing color on the mosaics of early synagogue, and he's gorgeous illuminated. You saw it a little bit in that synagogue clip. And I was very struck, just one document in the Geniza, Adam, actually, where it's a Jew complaining about the delay of a shmata order, of a piece of fabric. And he's saying, I'm very upset that I ordered a flame-colored robe, which, you think flame color, God, that's really going to be really beautiful. And he said, I wanted to wear it on Yom Kippur. And, which is shocking, because you're supposed to be dressed in the most absolutely chaste, humiliated, austere, super black and white. And I thought, well, he's going to shul in his gorgeous, kind of gaudy, iridescent orange outfit, you know. And color is really an intense part. And the clip we're going to see is of a synagogue in Slovakia. And the clip will speak for itself about what happened to the inhabitants of this provincial town called Košice. Anybody from Košice? And there are always people. And, okay, hi. And you'll also see stained glass windows, which are ravishingly beautiful. And the glass is, as I think you'll recognize from the modernist glass movement in Bohemia and Moravia and Slovakia, and therefore very likely this synagogue, which was a super Orthodox synagogue, was again a collaboration between Jews and Christians in this community. So
can we have the clip that's labeled Zvonarska?
At first, it seemed like a place of utter desolation. But then I saw them, the stylized angel's wings hovering over the ceiling. Out of the dust burst the colors, the blues of heaven, the reds of the kings of Judah, the rainbows coming through the glass. And then Amidst all this absence, I began to sense the presence, the cantor's chant, the murmuring banter. And there in the galleries were the women of Jewish Košice, and down below the men in silks and hats. In the spring of 1944, 15,700 Jews from Košice, the entire community, were sent to their deaths in Auschwitz. But this wasn't a place that sat passively, waiting for its death sentence. Before the Holocaust, Košice, like thousands of Jewish towns and villages strung across Central and Eastern Europe, was alive, thriving, confident, noisy. The opera and the klezmer, the schnorrer beggars and the prosperous merchants, the pushcart peddlers and the street corner revolutionaries. That this world somehow flourished despite all the pounding storms that would come its way is an escape act so epic that it counts as one of history's all-time redeeming miracles. Even when systematic annihilation overwhelmed the people, the world that had nourished them survived. This is the story about how this unique culture of faith and ferment, of poetry and music, of a search for deliverance from brutality and oppression, did not get pulverized by the hammer of history. It just changed its address.
So this is a synagogue in a town, all of whose Jewish residents perished.
Yeah,
I think
there may have been a few survivors, but basically it went. And as I say, it was kind of richly prosperous. It was one of many like it. Slovakia, it took a long time for the deportations to take place, because Slovakia was an ally of the Axis. It was quickly occupied, and therefore it was allowed to have control over its own Jewish population and their confinement. But I suppose what I wanted to do was, that sequence is sort of emblematic of it, is not overdeterminate. The third program, which is about the Enlightenment, is set overwhelmingly in the German-speaking world. And I tried to give the Moses Mendelssohn moment, the moment when it seemed entirely possible for Jews to be passionately German and passionately Jewish at the same time, its full freedom. Not the sense really that it was always inevitably going to end in the death camps and in the crematoria. I mean, to assume that really everything is sort of a march towards that is sort of basically, as I say at another point, as a hand of victory really to anti-Semites and Nazis. So you want to kind of honor and respect the intrinsic organic vitality of what was in place. And that's a film which really starts with Hasidism, a very difficult thing to make live in its proper 18th and early 19th century, but we use wonderful early silent Yiddish films courtesy of the National Jewish Film Archive in Brandeis, which, if any of you don't know it, please go to a website, get engaged with it, support it. It's the most wonderful resource, actually, of both Yiddish and Hebrew and sometimes English language early Jewish films. It's a lovely thing. And so we used them. They were very kind, and we used a lot of their archival footage for that.
Now, trying to imagine the life of a Jewish community in a place like Slovakia, a little bit out of range of the Cossacks, perhaps, but still pretty close there. Is there a way in which that very oppression against Jews helped the culture survive? There's another part of the film where you show a synagogue that's sort of built like a fortress. Whereas paradoxically in places in Western Europe where Jews have lived in situations of much greater tolerance, there's often a lot of intermarriage. People worry about, will the culture survive? What about that paradox?
Well, we don't. Have to register it exactly as you say, Adam. It would be a kind of, it would be a sad thing if we said, well, we do better, we cohere better, thanks to persecution. You want to believe that actually the energy and complexity and vitality of Jewish tradition in all its many aspects, purely religious, but things on the fringe of religion, Jewish Yiddish literature, which is not particularly religious. If any of you out there don't know the short stories of A.L. Peretz, for example, go to them. They're as good as Chekhov. They're truly astonishing things. So you want to believe that really there's a kind of self-nourishing aspect, but the historical fact is certainly that, when you're aware of actually pressure building on you, it certainly kind of brings you together. But I suppose I want to say that the world, and we filmed in Ukraine as well as Slovakia. Most of the film, about the first half of program number 4, was filmed in Podolia and Volhynia. You saw those still photographs, beautiful stills. They were actually taken by the social revolutionary and ex-religious figure S. Ansky, the author of the Dybbuk, on what he called a kind of ethnographical expedition into Galicia, southern Ukraine.
When were
1912 to 14, with his nephew. And all the material is preserved in the Ethnographic Museum of Petersburg, including music, but the photographs were lost until the, I think, early 1990s, and then they were found at the back of someone's sofa in St. Petersburg. It's an amazing story. And those photographs are truly extraordinary. So one thinks of the world of the shtetl in kind of Fiddler on the Roof terms of these kind of Jews existing in mudhole villages. But, of course, Hasidism is born in grandeur in the rather larger towns. And the kind of relationship between the grand Polish aristocracy, the Radzivills and the Czartoryskis and so on, and Jews who were brought in to exorcise demons and bless the harvest, and was really quite close. So actually Hasidism was not something that was born in a kind of pullulating ant-heap of mystically visionary poverty. It was born in circumstances of a confident relationship, really. That synagogue you mentioned at Satanov, which was close to where the Baal Shem Tov made his home, was what looks like, it is a stone synagogue because it was built shortly after the horrific Cossack massacres of 1648, but it couldn't have been built there unless the local landowner, I think was the Czartoryski, actually was happy with it being there and saw a Jewish presence as part of the way that part of Poland was supposed to be. We actually met a wonderful fellow called Boris, despite the Russian name, very much Ukrainian, with mostly a mouth of gold teeth, who'd grown up with this synagogue, and had then managed to join the part of the Red Army and came back after the war. And the synagogue had been ruined by the war, blown apart. I mean, the interior had been blown apart. There were Jewish stone carvings, very unusual in it, and it was due to be demolished by the Polish, the Ukrainian Soviet government. And Boris took it on himself, and we independently discovered this was true, to actually mount a one-man and then a very successful campaign for its preservation over the years. And he said to us, he was such a sweet fellow, doesn't actually appear in the film, though we have him in rough cut. By the way, everybody, we're going to have a really great website with the series and with lots of raw material that we couldn't use in the series. There's a very moving interview with the Israeli writer David Grossman, which appears as kind of 5 minutes. So the entire interview will be on lots and lots of material in its raw form will be on that website. Maybe the interview. So Boris said, who was no Jew lover, but he was certainly not a Jew hater, but he did love that synagogue. And he said when his wife was dying of cancer, we're in the 60s now, he went into the ruins of the synagogue and stood on the bima, what had been the reading desk of the synagogue, and said a prayer, a Catholic prayer for his wife. And he said, and I did not think she would be saved, but I felt she would be saved in heaven. It was incredibly touching, actually. Yeah.
Wow. I want to ask you a few things about how you undertake a project like this that results both in a book, the first volume of the 2-volume book, the second one's out this fall, right?
Yeah, with any luck.
And 5 hours of film. Are you thinking book and film right from the beginning? Do you work first on one, then on the other? Does the one determine the course of the other? How does all that work?
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean,
Because most of us just work in one
Right,
medium rather than two
but,
simultaneously.
well, I'm not someone who writes a book and then gives it to a director and says, now film this. You know, it doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
It's dead on arrival if you do that. As you kindly said, I've made lots and lots of these films, and I've learned that really it's two halves of your brain, actually, Adam. I mean, you do, in this particular case, when I took it on and took a deep breath and stopped saying, you know, you're my sugar, why do you do that? And said, it's a good thing to try and do. I began because I was very excited about Elefantini and also the amazing scholarship of other scholars about the beginnings of the Bible and the relationship. So I wrote a fair chunk, probably about a third of the book, and then really production time happened. And what you do is really, you have to really, I mean, literally it sounds so banal, but you know, you're working probably early in the morning, maybe Monday, Tuesday, Friday or something on the book, and then you say to yourself, okay, television Simon, writer, and what you do is you draw a line down the page on your computer and you write the shots on the left, even if you don't end up with them. You have to be a real screenwriter, at least in my kind of world of making documentaries. And so you have to have the images in your mind, and you have to have in mind the kind of the armature of a television hour. A good, never mind a great, historical documentary has to be almost like a non-fiction feature film. It has to obey certain rules of the narrative arc. You can't start a totally new story after minute 45. I mean, there are sort of weird little kind of tricks like that. So what you have to do, you're not kind of selling your story. You hope you're not selling your story short. You're distilling it in a kind of respectfully, fiercely disciplined way. And weirdly, you know, maybe with the medieval film and the sections that are about the relationship between Islam and Judaism and Christianity and Judaism, the ferocity, the kind of vulgar fierceness of having to, you know, observe that discipline sharpens what you're going to do in the book. It also, the book is, you know, writing, which, you know, you're a wonderful exemplar. You're doing all sorts of atmospherics about place and people and so on. And the atmospherics will be caught, as with Elefantini, by the camera. So they become redundant. So you're sort of like mad Siamese twins or something. The two of you are connected, and the two exercises are connected and nourish each other, I think. I don't think they really deplete each other, but they call for very different kind of sensibilities. And the television side of it is a collaborative craft. I love that. Our craft as writers is very solitary. We're really writing with ourselves. I don't know any historians I admire who say, well, I've got this particular audience in mind, you know, and I'm writing for them. I mean, we write what we feel is going to be a great story, and then we write it in you know, just ourselves, really. That's not how it works in television.
Maybe this is a good point to look at that last clip, and then you tell us the story behind it.
I will,
Can we have the one that I think is labeled Holocaust Remembrance Day in Israel?
במוצאי שבת, 1 בדצמבר, אנחנו ב-88 FM נעביר את התחרות בשידור חי.
Every year, in the spring, a country born from the ashes of annihilation remembers a loss for which there are no words.
everybody standing by their truck or their car or in the street just knows it could have been us. It's still heartbreaking. And then life goes on.
I love that little pirouette at the end.
Yeah.
There is not a complete film on the Holocaust. There are lots and lots of extraordinarily moving and powerful, not just films about the Holocaust, but of course actually a whole series. My colleague Lawrence Rees did an incredible long series on Auschwitz. So we don't, dance around the Holocaust. It's there, all right, in 3 of the films, particularly at the end of Program 4. But I didn't want to rehearse the whole thing, the rise of the Third Reich and the hideousness of what eventually happened. But I did want to register how it played in... we are a people of memory. We are the only religion in Shemot, in Exodus, and again in Deuteronomy, who are required to remember, Zachor. That's our obligation to the future generations. And we wanted to find a way. We talked about how we would do it, and there is another further sequence. This is in the beginning of the last program, which is a specific story of someone who's engaged with trying to alert the Western world to what was happening in the final solution. But at this particular moment, I knew, although I'd never actually seen it, that the Yom HaShoah in Israel, everybody stops what they're doing wherever they're doing it, including, as you saw, traffic. You don't park, you just stop. And there's always some idiot, even though the siren's going off, who Israeli drivers slams into the back of the person in front of them. And what the director and I, Tim Kirby and I said, why don't we ask students at the film schools in Israel, in Haifa and Tel Aviv and Beersheba, to go to a nursery school, an old age home, a hospital, a factory. I mean, I love that shot. It's very touching, I think, genuinely, not condescending to the Palestinian woman who slightly uncertainly stays sitting down, and the old lady who has a tattoo on her arm shaking her head. And the kids did a fantastic job. And I knew I didn't want to be at Yad Vashem, actually. I wanted to be at a traffic intersection, the busiest I could find in Tel Aviv, because the memory itself is like the Death Star. It just sort of hovers and stops over the fabric of normal life. And then, as I say, life goes on. The ultimate victory is just that life goes on. So we said, okay, we're going to have a tiny bit of commentary at the beginning of this, then we will shoot it in real time, we'll cut in all the student stuff, what we can use, there'll be no music, and then we'll pick up the rhythm of life, and that's what we did. And I don't know, that's, I think any filmmakers I admire are just never satisfied with what they do. They look at sequences and they say, oh, if only I'd shot it that way, I'd lit it differently. But there are certain moments when you think, you allow yourself to say, that's the way we wanted to do it, and we did it, and that's one of them.
I have 2 last questions for you, and then I want to give other folks here a chance to ask a few. And one question is this. You have written and made films about an incredible variety of things. Dutch culture, Rembrandt, the French Revolution, the history of Britain, the slaves in the United States, now the Jews, Tolstoy in Russia, all
you
kinds of
move
other
around
things.
yourself, young
Yeah,
Hochschild.
but wait a minute, you go much farther, and you do the films as well. And you've also held positions, as you do now, in history departments, Columbia, Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge. Hasn't a university dean or provost or somebody ever taken you aside and said, come on now, it's time to specialize like everybody else does?
Well, they never have. I mean, it's, the hedgehog-fox thing, I suppose, Isaiah Berlin's famous essay about Tolstoy's famous essay about Archilochus, who said the world divides into those who run around a lot in terms of Aristotelian cast of mind, who see in the diversity of human experience the incomparable complexity and abundance and plenitude of life and celebrate it. And there are writers who are super foxes, Dickens, I suppose, most famously. And then there are those who are obsessive, compulsive about the specialization. I don't know, Adam, I was never designed for hedgehoggery, really, actually. So I suppose it's, I don't know, attention deficit disorder, really, of a high level, or a kind of constant greed and appetite. I do think there are, I mean, I don't want to write my own biography, it would be horrifically egregious, of course, but Rembrandt aside, and possibly, even not putting him aside, the things that connect landscape and memory and the French Revolution book and this work and, for sure, Rough Crossings and History of Britain are all a prolonged exercise, exploration of the nature of allegiance. Who is your family? Who is your national family? What is your language family? What is your religious family? Who do you feel part of? Why do you feel part of that group? Are the boundaries hard? Are they soft? That has been, I mean, it's when I realized that the French Revolution, of course, was about various kinds of equalities, but it was above all about making France France in a new, radically new, replenished way. That seems to have been an abiding preoccupation, I think, actually, through a lot of what I've done.
So what's next? You've done the Jews? Is it the
well,
next,
I'm
the
doing
Christians? Or?
No, Buddhists. No, not really. No, I'm doing, I mean, it will see real vacation time, I think, after the extremely daunting rubric of this. But it is a much more parochial project, and it's certainly a project which falls into the category I've just tried to characterize. It's called The Face of Britain, and it's about portraiture. And it's also a television series, but it's about what we do when you and I, right now, look at each other, and how we read faces, and how that gets transcribed into photography and painting. So there was a very extraordinary book written by a colleague of mine in the Columbia Art History Department called Richard Brilliant on portraiture, where he describes portraiture as a three-triangular process. There is the sitter's sense of how he would like to be immortalized. There is the artist's inevitable sense of rather undermining that particular view. And then there is everybody else who gets shown it, the public or the court or whoever, or the boardroom. So the first section of that, we've written and we've mapped it out a bit. It's called The Face of Power. So it's what happens when the devotion to a monarch, the devotion to the Virgin Mary becomes the Virgin Queen instead, and all the way through to captains of industry. The second part of it is called A Face of Love, and it's about family portraiture, but also about the portraiture of married couples and not married couples, and when an artist falls in love with his subject. The third is The Face of Fame. How does face reading create fame? We start with David Garrick, actually, in the 18th century, the actor. The fourth one is called The Face of the People. Begins with Hogarth's portraits of his servants. Very moving. You know about Henry Tonks, right?
Yes.
I mean, who was one of the first two surgeons to work on horribly disfigured people who'd been mutilated in the First World War, but documented it in early photographs and paintings too. And the last one is self-portraiture, selfies. So, I mean, that will be, I think a pleasure to do, who knows.
Good.
Then I think it's time to die, actually.
No, not yet. Okay. We have time for a few questions from the rest of you here, and I believe you are supposed to... There are microphones at either side in front, so come up to the mic. It won't be passed to you. You have to come up to it, and then you can ask your question.
First question on this side.
Thank you. The style today is BCE and CE, and I'm wondering if your choice of words is deliberate, or your publisher, or whatever.
Oh, God, no, just couldn't care less, really, actually. But I'll tell you what happened was that I was brought up in Britain. It's a British thing. It's a British thing. The Brits really like it to be AD, and I didn't notice how strongly they felt about it. They like it to be AD and BC. All Jewish kids, because of the Anno Domini Christian thing, are always brought up with BC and CE. And so that's where I wrote the book. In the text of the book, it's BCE. Did you notice that already in the book? It's BCE and CE, like the Jewish way and the modern way of doing it, but the publishers stuck, AD and BC on it, and it survived to the American edition. So I didn't mean to be facetious to you, I promise, but to be honest, I didn't notice the anomaly on the jacket, so that's the truth, yeah.
Another question.
The next question will be on your right.
Do we have a question over there?
Can't see you.
Oh.
Okay. Hi, I'm a contemporary ketubah artist, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit.
Where are you? There was the wonderful thing, I mentioned Isaiah Berlin earlier, and I remember when I first heard him lecture, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I speak very low and very fast, and if you don't understand me, please indicate by some eccentricity of behavior." So, I can't see you, so if you do something kind of neurotic, it would be great.
Way up in the
great,
corner up
I
there.
can see you. Ketubah artist. Oh, yeah,
Yes,
great.
and I was wondering if you could speak about the role of the ketubah in your
wow.
scholarship and how you found them in the Geniza, etc.
Oh, no, I can't really, because, and I again don't mean to be facetious, because I think you probably know more about it than I can, but, it's famously Aramaic document, and thing of enormous beauty, but almost a thing of really steely, contractual elaboration. Because it is in Aramaic, it's not noticed how formal and... I think you need to sort of correct me. So you're a decorator of ketubot, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And do you do the Aramaic script as well? Or?
I do it, and you're
Wow.
right. It is something, it was composed 2,000 or more years ago.
Yeah.
So it's the exact same text that you
Yes.
were probably reading in those troves that you looked
Yes,
at.
in Elephantini. There are, they weren't called ketubot, of course, but that's exactly what they were. And, all the kind of provisos and complications about who gets usufruct of which kind of property and what happens. There is a strong tradition which way predates the Talmud, but is very strongly rooted in the Mishnah, actually, first, and then the Talmud, of actually dowry reverting to the bride if the husband predeceases her, and all those things are really set out. It's a wonderful thing about our religion. We saw on flights of kind of poetic lyricism and things like the Shir HaShirim or the Song of Miriam, and then there's this incredibly kind of chartered accountant, nitty-gritty rules for exactly earthly living in deeply, every conceivable circumstance. So I'm not sure I have much to say to you except to honor you for that. I will say that we did try, I've been talking about this, that actually, the book is called Finding the Words, and it is physically, I was very struck by rereading the Kabbalistic literature, particularly the Sefer Yetzirah, which I bet you know, and many of you know, which is the book of creation, written, it's thought, in the 6th century, which was the first to propose the adorable theory that God creates the universe out of letters, out of Hebrew letters themselves. And the letters are a life force. Our title sequence has letters forming human marching, human walking bodies, and then the bodies become letters again. So we were very conscious about the aesthetic relationship of writing. There's a big riff in the book towards the end about micrographic writing, which I'm sure you know about, which is entirely a Jewish invention. These absolutely minuscule. You see some of it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I still don't know how anyone with, average optical facility could actually do these Hebrew letters, which are almost microscopic, which are less than a millimeter big. So this whole sense of actually the poetic charge of writing on documents like a ketubah was very powerful for us. And I found an ex-Torah scribe. We actually show sequences with actual Torah scribes, but we knew they couldn't really work with us, in a studio. And these two brothers, one of whom was an animator, and Josh, who was American-born, ex-Torah scribe, did magnificent sort of animation, actually using, almost a dancing kind of calligraphy. It's not really an answer to your question, but
Thank you very much.
You probably figured that out. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more short question. So over on this side.
I just want to say to you, what's your name, sweetheart? What?
Oh, my name is Jessica Craft.
I bet you have. It's a great, flourishing industry now, isn't it? Actually, ketubah writing. I mean, you're in constant demand, right? As I understand it. No, I mean it's a wonderful thing. It's a flourishing renaissance, is it
and
not?
There are lots of non-Jews who want them now as well. I mean,
how do you feel about that?
Well, I think it's great to spread the tradition.
There are things that are happening to. I want to be allowed. Hopeless crankiness. In fact, there's a phenomenon that's happened in London. You all have to believe me. Two of the best restaurants in London recently, you're not going to believe me, are strictly kosher. And I mean, this is exquisite food. And there's one called 1701, which is in Bevis Smart. And my friend and colleague Jay Rayner, who's a food critic and very much a Jew, said, can we not be allowed to have our horrible Jewish cooking, actually, and be left alone? Can we be allowed not to be cool, actually? So there's this sense that, the ketubah, the Seder service now belongs to everybody. Leave us alone occasionally,
The last question will be on your right again.
Okay.
I wonder if you could just comment, please, on the Jewish revolt, sort of an alternative history, if in fact the revolt had not happened or it had not been so brutally crushed by the Romans.
Oh, the Romans, okay. Wow, it's always the last question is sort of basically the most encyclopedic. You're asking a counterfactual question if the Jewish revolt had won, really. Well, if it had won, the Jews...
My question, I think, was your comments on the Jewish revolt, if it hadn't happened or if the Romans hadn't so brutally crushed it and dispersed the Jews.
Well, it happened in the context of an incredibly Romanized monarchy, in the Herodian monarchy, didn't it? And it would have gone on becoming, continuously Roman, I suppose. I always do find it very difficult, and again, it's not to be a facetious put down in any way whatsoever, but I find it very difficult to do what's called counterfactual history. In other words, to imagine what would happen if certain other things, weren't in place. I mean, you forgive me for just moving the question a little aside. The only great source we have, apart from other Roman historians who retroactively comment on it, like Tacitus, is, of course, Josephus. And Josephus is someone who's both part of the Jewish revolt and then betrays it, more or less. He turns his coat towards the Romans. So he's kind of all we have to answer your question. Josephus thought, in the end, and he, Yochanan ben Zakkai, who founds basically what becomes Mishnaic studies, the oral tradition, agreed with him that the absolutely fight to the last body of the Jew resistance in Jerusalem by the Zealots was a futile, monstrous piece of, unnecessary suicide, really. And there is something weirdly, when you go and read, as obviously you have done, the whole of Josephus about the Jewish revolt, there is something weirdly asymmetrical about the ostensible, it's a tax revolt, it begins that way, the ostensible provocations that lead to the Jewish revolt, and this immense apocalypse which overcomes Jerusalem and to a larger extent Judea and Galilee as well. So you think, if you take that away, to try and answer your question, that all sorts of things that were happening inside the Jewish world, never mind the Romans, would have continued to happen. There would have been bitter arguments. You know, the Pharisees and the whole of that movement was essentially an intensely devoted, and they were actually called Hasidim at one point, intensely devoted religious movement of reform against the aristocratic temple establishment. In other words, this great kind of drama of going back to the Torah, of really going back to the purity of the Torah against its corruption in the temple, represented by the Sadducees of the state, would have gone on. There was an amazing moment, I'll stop that because it is getting very late. There's an incredible moment that I was very struck by, and I try to make a lot of it in the book, when Pompey conquers Jerusalem in 63 BC. And he comes to the gates of Jerusalem and he's entertaining contenders. And bitchy rivals in various bits of the Hasmonean dynasties said, it's our lot. And the other lot said, no, it's my brother Aristobulus and our lot. And the Hasidim, the religious leaders who are not part of the temple establishment, come to Pompey and say, get rid of them all. Get rid of them all. We don't really care, which set of Romanized, Hellenized pretenders want to be. We don't actually want a king of Judah at all. We actually want to go back to what happened with Moses and Aaron, where actually, the religion exists outside the state. And, have a look at this week's Haaretz or something. That argument continues to go on. So that is an intensely internal Jewish argument, and that would have gone on. And would have produced someone like, if not him, that Jew we all know, Jesus of Nazareth.
So
is that okay? I mean, is that
okay? Well, thank you, Simon. Thank you all for coming. There will be a book signing out in the atrium in a minute or two.
Thank you.